The treaty that changed everything, when one signature destroyed an empire. Picture this, right? You wake up one morning and discover that your entire country has vanished overnight. Not destroyed by bombs or natural disasters, but simply erased from the map by politicians with pens. Sounds mental, doesn't it? Well, that's precisely what happened to millions of people exactly 100 years ago. And the repercussions are still causing arguments across Central Europe today. What I am about to tell you is the story of the most controversial peace treaty you've probably never heard of. It's a tale of empires crumbling, nations being born, and entire populations finding themselves strangers in their own homeland, literally overnight. This isn't just ancient history, mate. This treaty is still stirring up passionate debates in pubs, parliaments, and family dinners across Central Europe right now. So grab a brew, settle in, because we're diving deep into one of the most dramatic border reshuffles in human history. By the time we're done, you'll understand why a single document signed in a French palace fundamentally changed the lives of over 20 million people, and why its effects are still being felt today. Now then, let's set the scene properly. It's November 1980, and the Great War has just ended. But here's the thing, whilst the guns had fallen silent on the Western Front, absolute chaos was erupting across Central Europe. The mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had dominated the region for centuries, was collapsing faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Think about it for a moment. This wasn't just any old country falling apart. We were talking about an empire that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, from Bohemia down to Bosnia. It was home to Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, and countless other ethnic groups. Imagine trying to untangle that mess without everyone ending up at each other's throats. The Kingdom of Hungary alone, and this is crucial to understand, made up roughly half of this massive empire. The Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph wasn't just ruling Austria. Oh no, he was simultaneously the King of Hungary too. It was like being the manager of two completely different football clubs at the same time, each with their own supporters, their own traditions, and their own ideas about how the game should be played. But here's where things get properly interesting. And this is something most people don't realize about Old Hungary, according to the 1910 census. And these numbers are absolutely vital to understanding what happened. Next, only about 54% of the people living in the Kingdom of Hungary were actually ethnic Hungarians. Let that sink in for a second. In a country called Hungary, nearly half the population wasn't Hungarian at all. You had German speakers in the western regions, Slovaks up north, Romanians throughout the east and south, and various Slavic groups scattered about. In some areas, Hungarians were actually the minority in their own kingdom. It's like discovering that half the people living in England don't actually speak English. You can imagine the complications that would cause. Now, when the empire started crumbling in the autumn of 1918, everyone and their grandmother suddenly declared themselves independent republic. Hungary said, right? We're a republic now, Slovakia said, see? We're joining up with the Czechs, thanks very much. The Romanians said, all these eastern territories, they're ours now. And the South Slavs were busy forming something called Yugoslavia. But here's the problem that nobody really thought through properly at the time. Where exactly should the borders be drawn? It's all well and good saying you're independent. But independence from what? And where does your country actually begin and end? This is where things got properly messy. And I mean absolutely chaotic. Because whilst everyone was arguing about borders, there were actual shooting wars breaking out all across the region. We're not talking about polite diplomatic discussions over tea and biscuits. There were proper military conflicts happening between Hungary and its neighbors, particularly with Romania. And here's the kicker. The Allied powers, the winners of the Great War, were actively supporting Hungary's neighbors in these conflicts. So whilst Hungary was trying to sort out its own political mess, with revolutions and counter-revolutions happening left, right, and center, its neighbors were busy grabbing as much territory as they could with Allied backing. By the end of 1919, when the dust had finally settled on these various conflicts, the situation on the ground was pretty much decided. Czechoslovakia controlled Slovakia, Romania controlled Transylvania, and several other eastern regions, and Yugoslavia controlled Croatia and parts of the south. Hungary had been carved up like a Sunday roast, and there wasn't much anyone could do about it. But wait, there's more. Because whilst all this chaos was unfolding across Central Europe, there was supposed to be a proper peace conference happening in Paris. You know, with diplomats and delegates and all that civilized stuff, where they'd sit down and work out the borders properly and fairly. The problem was, how do you negotiate a peace treaty when there's nobody stable enough to negotiate with? Hungary had gone through not one but two revolutions in 1919. First, there was a liberal democratic revolution. Then, a communist revolution that established something called the Hungarian Soviet Republic. It was like trying to nail jelly to a wall. Every time the diplomats thought they figured out who was in charge in Hungary, the government would change again. Eventually, an admiral named Miklos Horthy managed to establish some semblance of order in Hungary. Now, calling yourself an admiral in a landlocked country might seem a bit odd. But Horthy had actually served in the Austro-Hungarian Navy. He became regent of what was technically still a kingdom. But here's the bizarre bit. There wasn't actually a king. It was like having Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. Horthy's government brought stability, sure, but it came at a terrible cost. There was something called the White Terror, which was essentially a campaign of violence against anyone suspected of leftist sympathies or Jewish background. It was a dark period that stained Hungary's reputation just when it needed international sympathy the most. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the diplomats were having a field day carving up Central Europe without any Hungarians present to argue their case. The Czechoslovaks, Romanians, and Yugoslavs had been invited to the peace conference months before any Hungarian delegation, giving them plenty of time to make their arguments and influence the Allied powers. These neighboring countries had several compelling arguments for keeping the territories they'd already occupied. First up was ethnic self-determination. The idea that people should be governed by states that represented their ethnic identity. Fair enough, you might think. Except the reality was far more complicated than any neat ethnic map could show. They also argued that Hungary had been systematically oppressing non-Hungarian minorities for decades through something called Magyarizása, essentially a policy of promoting Hungarian language and culture. Whether you saw this as cultural promotion or cultural oppression, rather depended on which side of the fence you were sitting on. There was also the argument about social justice. Hungary's neighbors painted a picture of the old Hungarian kingdom as a feudal society where Hungarian aristocrats lorded it over downtrodden peasants of other ethnicities. Even British Prime Minister Lloyd George seemed sympathetic to this view, suggesting that Hungary was desperately in need of a social revolution. But even amongst Hungary's neighbors, things weren't entirely straightforward. The Yugoslavs and Romanians both wanted parts of the Banat region, and within Yugoslavia itself, there were tensions between different ethnic groups. a Croatian delegate to the peace conference, rather snobbishly dismissed the Serbs as Balkan hybrids, which gives you some idea of the regional tensions involved. Despite these internal squabbles, Hungary's neighbors had good reason to be optimistic about the outcome of the peace conference. They'd been there first, they'd built relationships with the Allied powers, and most importantly, they were seen as being on the winning side of the war. The Allied powers themselves, Britain, France, and Italy, had their own agendas and were unentirely in agreement about what to do with Central Europe. The British, frankly, didn't know much about the region and weren't particularly bothered about it. Lloyd George famously had to ask whether Serbs and Croats even spoke the same language. Which, to be fair, isn't actually a stupid question given the complexities of South Slavic languages. The French, on the other hand, had very clear strategic goals. They wanted to create a ring of friendly states in Eastern Europe that could serve as allies against Germany and as a barrier against the spread of Bolshevism from Russia. Romania was seen as a crucial part of this strategy, which meant supporting Romanian territorial claims. The Italians were mainly focused on their new border with Yugoslavia and were worried about recreating the old rivalry they had with Austro-Hungary in the Adriatic region. They were so concerned about Yugoslav power that they actually secretly supported the Hungarian Soviet Republic during its conflict with Yugoslavia, which shows just how complicated these alliances could get. What united all three Allied powers, though, was a rather dismissive attitude towards Hungary itself. They saw it as oppressive, backward, and somehow Asiatic, a particularly nasty bit of prejudice that painted Hungarians as fundamentally different from civilized Western Europeans. This attitude was perhaps best summed up by French General Franchet d'Esprit when he addressed the Hungarian delegation that finally arrived in Paris in January 1920. His words were brutal. "I know your history. In your country, you have oppressed those who are not. Now you have the Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians, Yugoslavs as enemies. I hold these people in the hollow of my hand. I have only to make a sign and you will be destroyed." Lovely chap, clearly. But his words reflected the general Allied attitude towards Hungary. They were seen as the oppressors getting their not as victims deserving sympathy. The Hungarians weren't invited to the peace conference until December 1919, nearly a full year after it had started. By the time they arrived in Paris in January 20, the draft treaty had already been prepared without any Hungarian input whatsoever. It est like being invited to a dinner party only to discover that not only has everyone already eaten, but they've decided what you're having for dessert too. For Count Albaraponi and the rest of the Hungarian delegation, reading the draft treaty must have been like receiving a death sentence. The terms were absolutely devastating. Most of the pre-war Kingdom of Hungary would be handed over to neighboring countries, including areas where Hungarians formed clear majorities and had lived for centuries. When news of the proposed treaty terms reached Hungary, the reaction was one of complete outrage. The Hungarian press published articles in English, desperately trying to reach Allied audiences. They even created a map showing what Britain would look like if it were subjected to similar territorial losses. Imagine losing Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and half of England, and you'd be getting close to what was being proposed for Hungary. The slogan that emerged from this national trauma was simple but powerful. Nem nem soha. No, no, never. It became a rallying cry that would echo through Hungarian politics for decades to come. But slogans and newspaper articles weren't going to change anything. The Hungarian delegation in Paris had virtually no negotiating power. Unlike the other peace treaties, there would be no face-to-face negotiations allowed. The terms were essentially take it or leave it. There was, however, one glimmer of hope. Count Apony would be allowed to make a presentation to the Allied powers. This was Hungary's one chance to make its case, and they chose their representative well. Apony was a respected European aristocrat, nicknamed the Grand Old Man of Central Europe. If anyone could sway the Allied leaders, it would be him. Apony's speech would become legendary in Hungarian history, representing their country's last desperate attempt to avoid complete dismemberment. Speaking in excellent English, French, and Italian, he made several compelling arguments for the Hungarian cause. First, he argued that the Kingdom of Hungary had been a successful multi-ethnic state with a good track record of different groups living together harmoniously. This was, to put it mildly, a somewhat rose-tinted view of Hungarian history. But there was some truth to the argument that the Old Kingdom had functioned as a coherent economic and social unit. Second, he argued that the proposed borders would destroy an integrated economic system based on regional specialization. The Old Kingdom had been set up so that different regions produced different things. Grain from the Great Plains, timber from the mountains, industry from certain cities. Breaking this up would hurt everyone economically, not just Hungary. Third, and perhaps most importantly, he argued that the principle of ethnic self-determination should apply to Hungarians too, not just to their neighbors. If Romanians in Transylvania deserved to be united with Romania, then, surely, Hungarians living in those same areas deserved some consideration as well. His proposed solution was elegant in its simplicity. Hold plebiscites in the disputed regions and let the people vote on which state they wanted to join. Hungary would accept the results regardless of the outcome. He also suggested a Swiss-style federal model for a larger Hungary, with regional autonomy for minority groups. Apony concluded his presentation with a powerful appeal to Woodrow Wilson's principle of we refer to President Wilson's eloquently formulated an excellent principle, by which no part of the population of any state can be placed like cattle under the jurisdiction of a foreign government without its permission. We demand plebiscites in those areas of our country that you wish to take from us. I declare that we will accept the results of the plebiscites, no matter what they might be. The Hungarian delegation had prepared hundreds of documents, maps, and statistical analysis to support their case. Their ethnographic map, in particular, made quite an impression on some Allied delegates, showing in vivid color the complex ethnic patchwork of Central Europe. And you know what? The speech actually went down rather well. The Italian Prime Minister, Orlando, was visibly moved. Lloyd George listened intently, and even the usually hostile French leader, Clemenceau, was described as surprisingly polite. For a moment, it seemed like Hungary might actually have a chance. This partial success terrified the Czechoslovak, Romanian, and Yugoslav delegations. They quickly coordinated a response, with Czechoslovak Foreign Minister Edvard Benes contacting Belgrade and Bucharest to form a united front. The result was a joint memorandum, reminding the Allies of Hungarian oppression of minorities and warning that any changes to the peace terms would be seen as a betrayal of their alliance. Clemenceau remained adamantly opposed to any concessions, fearing that if they made changes for Hungary, Germany might demand changes to the Treaty of Versailles as well. This was a crucial point. The French were terrified that any sign of weakness would unravel the entire post-war settlement. Lloyd George did show some hesitation, recognizing that completely ignoring Hungarian concerns might create permanent enmity. But other British leaders opposed any concessions, and the region simply wasn't considered vital to British interests. The foreign press was also largely unsympathetic to the Hungarian cause, pointing to the White Terror and anti-Semitic violence in Hungary as evidence that any plebiscites might not be conducted fairly. But perhaps most importantly, there was simply no appetite for reopening the peace terms. As one historian put it, what ultimately weighed against Hungary was sheer inertia. The difficult work of drafting the treaty had already been done, other treaties had already been signed, and nobody wanted to go through the whole process again. A Hungarian government report concluded bleakly. The situation is very bad. Hope for substantial improvements is very slight. In May 1920, the Hungarian government briefly considered rejecting the treaty terms altogether, but eventually decided this would be both futile and dangerous. There was no choice but to sign. And so, on June 4th, 1920, at the Grand Trianon Palace at Versailles, Hungarian representatives put their signatures to a document that would reshape Central Europe. The ceremony took just 15 minutes, but its effects would last for generations. The treaty was modeled on the Treaty of Versailles, which meant it included all the usual punitive measures. There was a war guilt clause, forcing Hungary to accept responsibility for the war and pay reparations to its neighbors. The Hungarian army was limited to just 35,000 men, with tanks, warships, and aircraft forbidden entirely. Even Hungary's Danube fleet would be confiscated. Hungary's neighbors were also allowed to make claims on cultural and artistic artifacts from Hungarian museums and collections, and they could receive capital shares in Hungarian companies. It was like a garage sale, except Hungary wasn't doing the selling. But of course, it was the border changes that were the most dramatic and remain the most controversial today. Let's break down exactly what Hungary lost, because the scale of it is genuinely staggering. Romania received Transylvania, Maramureș, Cricana, and Banat, massive territories that included some of Hungary's most important cities and most fertile agricultural land. Czechoslovakia received Slovakia and Carpathian Ruthenia, what had been known as Upper Hungary for centuries. Yugoslavia received Croatia, Slavonia, and West Banat territories that had been part of the Hungarian crown for over 1,000 years. Poland received part of the Spiš region in the north. Italy would administer the port city of Fiume on the Adriatic coast, and even neutral Austria received the province of Burgenland, although, interestingly, the main city of Sopron would later vote in a plebiscite to return to Hungary, the only such vote actually allowed. When all was said and done, the new Hungarian state was less than one-third the size of the pre-war kingdom. The population dropped from 20 million to just 7 million, while 3 million ethnic Hungarians found themselves living as minorities in neighboring countries. The new Hungary was left with an agriculture-heavy economy, but virtually no industry, most of which had been located in the territories that were now part of other countries. It was like having your house burgled, except the burglars took the kitchen, the bathroom, and 2 of your 3 bedrooms. These were genuinely dramatic changes to the map of Central Europe, and the Allied powers knew it. French Prime Minister Alexander Millerand acknowledged this in a special letter attached to the treaty. The nationality situation in Central Europe is such that it is not possible to make political frontiers fully agree with ethnic frontiers. As a result of this, the powers, although not without regret, had to decide to leave certain areas with ethnic Hungarian population under the sovereignty of other states. The letter also rejected Hungarian calls for plebiscites, but did hint that future border adjustments might be possible through something called a delimitation commission. Many Hungarians interpreted this as a sign that the treaty terms might not be permanent, and when the government ratified the treaty, they actually incorporated this letter into Hungarian law. But the treaty wasn't meant to be temporary, and Hungary's borders today largely mirror those established at Trianon. Despite some temporary changes during World War II, when Hungary briefly regained some territories, the Treaty of Trianon became what historians call a national trauma for Hungary. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Hungarian politics revolved entirely around the question of revising the treaty terms. There was enormous bitterness against Hungary's neighbors, and some politicians even blamed Hungary's own minorities, particularly the Jews, for the country as creating a toxic stab-in-the-back mythology. Nearly every political group in Hungary opposed the treaty, and the country came to see itself as an isolated victim in a hostile world. This sense of grievance would have profound consequences for Hungarian foreign policy in the decades that followed, ultimately contributing to Hungary's alliance with Nazi Germany during World War II. Now, some historians argue that Trianon was the harshest of all the post-World War I peace treaties, and there's certainly a case to be made for that view. Hungary lost more territory proportionally than Germany did. Under Versailles, and unlike Germany, Hungary had no realistic prospect of recovering its losses through economic growth or diplomatic negotiation. But from the perspective of Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia in 1920, the treaty represented something entirely different. For them, it was the creation or reunification of their national states and the rectification of centuries of historical wrongs. They saw themselves not as beneficiaries of Hungarian misfortune, but as peoples finally achieving the self-determination that had been denied to them under Hungarian rule. The tension between those who supported the new post-order and those who opposed it, like Hungary and Germany, would define Central European politics for the next 2 decades. The settlement reached at Trianon was supposed to bring peace and stability to the region. But in many ways, it only created new sources of conflict and resentment. And that, fundamentally, is why the Treaty of Trianon still matters today. It is not just a historical curiosity from 100 years ago. It is a story about how borders are drawn, how peace is made, and how the decisions of politicians in distant capitals can fundamentally reshape the lives of millions of ordinary people. The echoes of Trianon can still be heard today in political speeches in Budapest, in textbooks in Bucharest, and in family stories passed down through generations across Central Europe. It is a reminder that history isn't just something that happened to other people a long time ago. It is something that continues to shape our world today. So the next time you look at a map of Europe, remember that those neat lines between countries represent real human stories of triumph and tragedy, of communities divided and nations born. The Treaty of Trianon may have been signed in just 15 minutes a century ago, but its effects are still unfolding today. That's the first part of our story, sorted then. But we're just getting started, because the real drama of what happened next, how these border changes actually played out, how families were torn apart, how new identities were forged, and how the seeds of future conflicts were planted. That's where things get really fascinating. And trust me, you're going to want to stick around for what comes next, because the human cost of this political reshuffling was absolutely staggering. But I'll save that tale for when you send me the next part of the content. Until then, keep that mind ticking over about what we've just learned, because understanding Trianon is crucial to understanding pretty much everything that happened in Central Europe for the rest of the 20th century. And when I say everything, I mean everything. From the rise of fascism, to the Cold War, to the conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s. One treaty really did change everything. Right then, that's part 1 wrapped up. Ready for the next installment when you are, because this story is far from over. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!